So before we start, I do have a second channel. So if you are interested in more content that isn't related to anime and manga, consider going over there and subscribing. Also, if you end up enjoying this video, consider leaving a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. So I thought I would make a nice, simple, easy video talking about a character that everyone fears. A character that has so much value and presence, even when they're not even within the main spotlight, even when they're not even visually seen within the story. Just their lingering aura is enough to send shivers down people's spines. But the reason I wanted to talk about this character is for one specific reason. Well, to be honest, a multitude, but it also boils down to one conversation. That conversation is the perspective of death, the concept of death even, within JujutsuKaisen specifically. Because as we go further within JujutsuKaisen's narrative, as we see different concepts of death and its alteration, there's a lot of interesting things that Akutami, the author, does when it comes to that consequence. Not only for this one specific character, but for everyone. So with that, let's have a look at this one character that everyone fears, and the weird limbo state that he sits within regarding the concept of death. I think at this point, the name Toji Fushiguro has become like a household thing. If you've read Jujutsu Kaisen up to a certain point, Toji is most likely going to be a character you will never forget, and for a very good reason. The way he's introduced into the story, how climatic it truly was, the effect that he had on pretty much the most powerful character within the story, and then his lingering presence after that is unmatched. For me, I truly appreciate characters that have this everlasting presence without even actually being within the story. Just mentioning their name or what they've done or an event that they've been a part of sends shivers down people's spines. They don't even want to speak his name, let alone mention anything surrounding him. Obviously, this is only as good as the value that that character brings across, how they're actually seen within the story for the first time. So having him up against a character that we have seen for 80 odd chapters up to that point as the most powerful to ever exist, obviously being Gojo, it's quite a surprise when you see Gojo at a younger age actually get challenged by him. But it's not necessarily another sorcerer. It's not someone that has an equal amount of overwhelming ability or power. It's someone that has none of that. It's someone that has no cursed energy whatsoever. It's someone that has broken their heavenly restriction. It's someone that quite literally is only using hand-to-hand combat. Very interesting. Because of this very simple thing, Toji, the effect that he has, the danger he brings across, and the injuries he actually provides to a younger Gojo is inherently impressive. But it doesn't stop there. While he's completely out of the story, his presence slightly lingers, and it sits within the realm of death and the concept surrounding it. The more you progress through the story, the more you find out about Toji, what he actually was, how or why he broke his heavenly restriction, and how much of an anomaly that was, how much power he truly had. And then you see him actually resurface once again to solidify how dangerous of a person he truly is. This is someone that we thought was just dead and that he would never reappear back into the story, but when he was called upon by someone else's ability, only to channel into another person's body, he overrided it completely. He took control over that body, took possession over it, and it's because of how powerful he truly is. You could argue that this is his soul. This is its everlasting power and value and just overwhelming nature that no one can really compete with. Only the top of the top, realistically. So he snatches his body. He goes on this rampage. He completely obliterates very powerful people with ease and doesn't even break a sweat. You don't see him use any powers. You don't see him kind of utilize anything else other than what he is comfortable with, and it is still inherently impressive. It's actually quite alarming how efficient he is, how prominent he is when being brought back to some degree after his death and being forced within a body, completely overriding it or overpowering it, and then going on a rampage to his own desire. So this event within Shibuya not only cements the fact that he isn't the worst father to ever exist, he actually cares for his son and he has his reasonings and the kind of nuance behind his thought process, which is very interesting to find out when he encounters his own son. But it also cements the idea that this man is just built different. He is on a completely different league, and that even death itself is barely even an issue for him, which sounds weird because obviously death should be a one-way thing. There's no coming back from it. But if there there is powers out there, like the reason why he came back within Shibuya, he's still just as efficient. And mind you, this is a portion of Toji. What we seen in Shibuya was only a fraction of what he truly was. It was not his full potential, it was not his full capabilities, but I believe it was in his prime state, if I remember correctly. But you're still limited to the body that you're in, the tools that you're using, and everything else in between. So even though he might have been brought back in the most powerful of his states, the body and every other semantic in between just couldn't keep up. From here, you have the constant reiteration of his character, going back to his reveal, his lore, the heavenly restriction, and the whole interpretation of Maki being a parallel to him. See, I would argue that Maki is a beautiful reflection of Toji, but her own version of it. She's not Toji 2.0, she is Maki. And I like to kind of make that distinction because I think it's important that even though their lines are very similar, their mental state, where they come from, how they've been raised, and pretty much what they embody are entirely different. So yes, Maki may evidently get to a point of power very similar to Toji, which I wouldn't doubt for a moment, but she's not a 2.0. She's a parallel. She's an opposite side. She's the next step in evolution for it. If Toji was an anomaly with what he actually done, the first person to break those heavenly restrictions and completely derive himself of cursed energy, Maki would be his successor. It is now becoming a more frequent thing, and you can kind of see potentially the process that Toji had to go through to remove his cursed energy, to break his heavenly restriction, free himself and become the true anomaly that people recognized him as. Very good. Now the real question is, what does this have to do with the concept of death? How does this correlate to Jujutsu Kaisen's usage of death and its consequence? Well, let me take you down my thought process. See, I really like the way Jujutsu Kaisen handles its death, because you have so many different variations for it. The concept of death is obviously pretty straightforward. It should be a one-way thing. It is a consequence, and a lot of stories like to tiptoe around it in whatever way they see fit. Some might play on it very heavily and make it known, others may never mention it at all, but you know it's within a story. I guarantee you've probably read a manga or seen an anime that does not mention death even once, but you know it's in there, so it may come as a surprise when characters actually die. But if they don't die, if nothing happens whatsoever because the story doesn't go down that direction, you probably won't be any of the wiser. You probably won't even care. However, the stories that acknowledge death or frequent around consequence-based events like fighting, for example, obviously death is going to be a lot more of a prominent thing. And because you have that consequence, it makes it very validating. It makes it very powerful. If you have two characters fighting with so much power and intensity, that concept and consequence of death uplifts it even further, that potentially one of these characters could die. Now, you may like both of these characters, you may hate both of these characters, but knowing that one of them could potentially die because of their injuries, because of the intensity of this battle, uplifts the whole thing. That's why the concept of death is really engaging. However, you'll find stories that tend to warp or tiptoe or alter the concept of death. Sometimes it can be really good and interesting, and other times it can be pretty lackluster and kind of diminish or devalue that consequence. If you have a story that involves any sort of frequent fighting, diminishing or devaluing death itself is probably the worst thing that you can do, because the tension is no longer there. The tension is going to drop drastically. You may build up this beautiful and glorious fight or final war, but you know that barely any people are going to die because of how devalued the concept of death is. No one has died up until this point to the story. Maybe some characters have died, but all of them have been brought back in some way, shape, or form. And while it can be seen as disrespectful, sometimes it's very choicy. Now, obviously, there's a lot of semantics and situations that go into this. You don't have to have the concept of death within your story, and you can still have an incredibly intense fight. It's not always about death, but in that case, you want to put your focus elsewhere. You want to fill in that blank. If you're not going to use the tension and anxiety that overlooming death brings and provides, you should probably replace it, right? Kaisen likes to do variations. So while you've seen the concept of death pretty straightforward, one-way ticket, there is alternatives. So you have the main one, which is the one we've just talked about, the most frequent one, the most obvious one. It's super simple, super easy. But you also have one that parallels it, a 2.0 version, a alteration of it, and that is for curses. See, the curses do not follow the same rules for death as humans do. Even sorcerers themselves potentially don't follow the normal rules of death. There is specifics. And this is really interesting because it adds variety. Side note, for clarity, the concept of death that curses face is not as drastic. Death for them most likely wouldn't be as big of a deal, nor as a one-way ticket compared to humans, as they can come back in a handful of mana years and retain something partially of their previous self. It's like borderline being immortal, but you still experience death, but you know that it's not the final thing. But for humans, obviously it's one way. There's no real detours that you can take to potentially come back unless you sit within the middle, which in this case, sorcerers do. Because of this, the whole dynamic of Jujutsu Kaisen, its curses, its sorcerers, and its humans is super interesting. So its concept of death is split between all three of them. Sorcerers don't die the same way humans do. They potentially can turn into very vengeful spirits, which isn't a one-way ticket. We've also seen Toji, who still technically is a sorcerer, but is kind of a more evolved human, be brought back from death, still retaining his mentality, his emotions, his memories, everything, basically. You have people like Geto, who hasn't been themselves for a very long time because of Kenjaku and Kenjaku's ability specifically, but his body is still inherently alive. It sparks some sort of response when Gojo tried to reach out to him. It tried to choke Kenjaku out. You have Mahito, who can warp and manipulate people's souls and recognize that the body and the soul is inherently linked. On top of that, you have Kenjaku awakening humans and awakening curses and bringing people back from 1,000 years ago. Some curses and some maybe potentially human. Do you see how the concept of death is super convoluted within the middle? On curses, it's pretty straightforward as well, as they'll probably come back in some way, shape or form, and over a handful amount of years, they'll be back to their normal previous self with maybe something of their prior life. And for humans, it's a one-way ticket. This is all groundwork for Toji because honestly, I believe he's coming back. At first, I thought, you know what, this character is just a one-time thing. And this was for Gojo's flashback. And I was perfectly fine with him not returning ever again. But then comes Shibuya, he does return, and his influence is crazier than ever. He drives a massive portion of Shibuya down this cataclysmic avenue of completely unexpected expectation. You don't know what he's going to do or how he's going to achieve it or what power he's going to bring across. Him being brought back in that way was unpredictable. No one would have seen it coming. And then once again, he disappears, he dies. You then have stuff after it that constantly reinforces the idea that obviously he is infinitely more important than we would have ever expected. Even though he's been held at such a high regard, we find out information that has so much inherent value behind it that makes him the kind of opposite heartbeat to Jujutsu Kaisen's story. He becomes a primary infrastructure, a pillar, a portion of architecture for its narrative. And then you have Maki becoming a reflection of him, a parallel, evolving into something else entirely, the next step in human evolution. We are moving forward to the Culling Games, a place where sorcerers from 1,000 years ago are coming back to thrive and fight and to battle it out to their heart's desires. Everything that I have just talked about gives me full confidence that in some point within the Culling Games, depending on its length, maybe even after it, that Toji will make his appearance once again. In what way, shape or form, I am not entirely sure, but we have seen that death is not an issue for him at this point. There is abilities that can bring a portion of him back. There is ways for him to potentially exist because of how powerful he truly is, because of his everlasting presence and how potent it is. At one point within the story, I would probably dislike this idea because it devalues the concept of death. But as Jujutsu Kaisen moved forward and cemented the idea and kind of painted a much more vibrant picture of its concept, of its consequences, and the nuance between curses, humans, and sorcerers that are in between, they all share it at a different value. Again, at one point, I was fine with Toji not coming back. I didn't think he would come back. But with the overall amount of attention that has been brought to him, the reveals, the understanding, I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back once again and shows us what he truly is capable of against people that could rival him with such intensity from 1,000 years ago. For me, this is the perfect playground for him, the perfect battlefield where he can truly let loose with everything that he's ever wanted to do against people that could rival him to such an extent. If you bring him back into the picture in some way, shape shape or form, whether it's through Kenjaku, whether it's through a rule, whether it's through another sorcerer from 1,000 years ago having a technique that's able to do it. These people are itching for a quality fight, and he would evidently provide that. But just to sprinkle the final bit of seasoning, you have the sheer demonic aura that is Gojo. And if, for whatever reason, he actually becomes unsealed towards the ending of the Culling Games, you know this is not going to end well for a lot of people, and that you will most likely see a side of Gojo that we have not seen before, or only seen a very small, slight version of it, and the only person to ever achieve that is none other than Toji himself. So what better way to kind of introduce both a side of Gojo that we have barely seen, a very monstrous dark side that is extremely powerful, alongside the reintroduction and the final power or final showcase of Toji Fushiguro himself. They may not have to fight, they may not even cross paths, but I think it would be a very exciting and beautiful build up to that final escalation, to that final conflict. The Culling Games for me feels like a very massive transitioning point. The story itself has rotated very drastically and transitioned into something else entirely. Considering what Kenjaku wants to become, what he's trying to do, if he's able to pull it off, the ending of JujutsuKaisen is very clearly in sight. The Culling Games, you could kind of consider it like the big midway point leading into the finale, and Kenjaku evolving is kind of like the flagship entry point for it. That this is where things change, that this is where the power starts to escalate further and further, and you've seen it already. You've seen characters grow exponentially quick to keep up with what the Culling Games is about to give birth to. And whether or not Toji is a part of that, I'm not entirely sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if Akutami does bring him back for one last time, for one last send-off, for the massive climatic fight that I feel like he deserves. At this rate, only time will tell. Endtime. So with that being said, welcome to the end of the video. I want to thank you all for watching, but I would love to know how you feel about Toji. Do you think he should come back within the Culling Games as a body, as a mind, as an emotion, some sort of reference to him? There's a lot of ways you could go about his character, and Akutami has kept him relatively low-key because of it. So in that sense, he's still playing true to the role that was given to him. An anomaly. Will that be provided within the Culling Games? I'm not sure, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it. But with all of that, I want to thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Drink plenty of water. Leave a like and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. And I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.